I am Miss Marple, and this village is never as quiet as it appears. Welcome to my new case.
The snow had been falling steadily since tea time on Christmas Eve, transforming the village of St. Mary Mead into something resembling a Christmas card illustration. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, watching the large flakes drift past the warm glow of her sitting-room lamp, when she heard the distant sound of raised voices carrying across the crisp evening air from the direction of Thornfield Manor. Sir Henry Blackwood's annual Christmas Eve gathering was, she knew, one of those family traditions that often proved more trying than joyful for all concerned. The elderly baronet, now approaching his 75th year, had been hosting these elaborate celebrations for decades, bringing together relatives who might otherwise prefer to maintain a comfortable distance from one another throughout the year. Miss Marple had received her invitation through Lady Eleanor Blackwood, Sir Henry's wife, who had been a distant acquaintance since their youth. "Do come, Jane," Lady Eleanor had pressed during their chance encounter at the post office. "Henry does so enjoy having interesting people about, and I confess I could use the moral support. The family can be rather intense during the holidays." Now, as Miss Marple made her way carefully along the snow-dusted lane toward the manor, her sensible boots crunching softly on the white carpet beneath her feet, she reflected on what she knew of the Blackwood family dynamics. Sir Henry, despite his advancing years, remained a formidable personality who had strong opinions about how his considerable estate should be managed and, more importantly, how it should eventually be distributed among his heirs. The manor's windows glowed warmly against the winter evening, and through them Miss Marple could see the familiar tableau of a family Christmas gathering. In the drawing-room, Sir Henry himself commanded the center of attention, his robust frame still imposing despite his age, gesturing expansively as he spoke to his assembled relatives. His son Charles, a man in his late 40s with the slightly harried look of someone perpetually trying to live up to his father's expectations, stood near the fireplace with his wife Patricia, a nervous woman who had never quite seemed comfortable in the grand surroundings of her husband's childhood home. Their teenage daughter, Susan, sat somewhat apart, reading a book with the determined air of someone trying to appear above the family proceedings. More intriguing to Miss Marple's observant eye was the presence of Sir Henry's nephew, Geoffrey Blackwood, who had arrived from London that morning. Geoffrey, she had heard through the village's efficient gossip network, had recently experienced some financial difficulties with his import business and had been making increasingly frequent visits to his uncle's estate. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, admitted Miss Marple with obvious relief. "Oh, Miss Marple, how good of you to come. Lady Eleanor will be so pleased. I'm afraid the evening has been rather tense." As Miss Marple was led into the drawing-room, she immediately sensed the undercurrents of strain beneath the festive surface. Sir Henry was in the middle of what appeared to be a heated discussion with Geoffrey about modern business practices and the importance of maintaining family traditions. "Ah, Miss Marple," Sir Henry boomed, his face flushed either from the warmth of the fire or from the intensity of his conversation. "How delightful that you could join us. I was just explaining to my nephew here the importance of understanding one's responsibilities to the family legacy." Geoffrey's smile was tight as he acknowledged Miss Marple's arrival. "Uncle Henry has very definite ideas about how things should be done," he said, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes betraying irritation. Lady Eleanor approached Miss Marple with obvious gratitude. "Jane, dear, do let me get you some mulled wine. We were just about to exchange our traditional Christmas Eve gifts." She lowered her voice slightly. "Henry insists on maintaining all the old customs, even though they do seem to create such complications these days." Miss Marple accepted the warm cup gratefully and positioned herself in a chair that afforded her an excellent view of the room's occupants. She had learned long ago that the most revealing moments in any family gathering occurred not during the formal exchanges, but in the small, unguarded gestures and glances that people assumed went unnoticed. As Sir Henry began distributing elaborately wrapped packages, Miss Marple observed the subtle dynamics at play. Charles received his gift with dutiful gratitude, though she noticed his hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped what appeared to be a set of antique cufflinks. Geoffrey's present was notably smaller, and his expression grew increasingly dark as he opened it to reveal a simple leather bookmark. "For your reading," Sir Henry said pointedly. "I thought you might benefit from spending more time with books on fiscal responsibility." The insult was delivered with such genial malice that Miss Marple felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Geoffrey's face went white, then flushed deep red, and for a moment she thought he might respond with equal venom. Instead, he set the bookmark aside with exaggerated care and excused himself to step out onto the terrace for some fresh air. It was then that Mrs. Pemberton's scream shattered the uneasy calm, followed immediately by the sound of breaking glass from the direction of Sir Henry's study. The scream cut through the festive evening like a blade through silk, and for one suspended moment, the drawing-room became a tableau of shocked faces frozen in the lamplight. Then Charles dropped his brandy glass, Patricia gasped aloud, and the entire family surged toward the corridor in a rush of rustling fabric and urgent footsteps. Miss Marple moved with them, her practiced eye already noting the subtle differences in their responses. Charles led the charge with the dutiful panic of a son accustomed to managing crises, while Patricia clutched at his arm with genuine terror. Lady Eleanor followed with remarkable composure, though her knuckles were white where they gripped her shawl. Young Susan pressed close behind, her book forgotten, her face pale but alert with the peculiar fascination that tragedy holds for the young. They found Mrs. Pemberton standing in the doorway of Sir Henry's study, one trembling hand pressed to her mouth, the other pointing into the room with helpless horror. "Oh, sir," she managed through her tears, "I came to tell him coffee was ready, and I heard such a crash, and then—" The study told its own terrible story. Sir Henry lay crumpled beside his overturned desk chair, his silver hair matted with blood, his evening jacket torn at the shoulder. The heavy crystal decanter that had stood on his desk lay shattered near the fireplace, its contents spreading in dark stains across the Persian carpet. Papers were scattered everywhere, and most telling of all, the French doors to the terrace stood wide open, letting in swirls of snow that had already begun to dust the mahogany furniture. A brass letter opener, ornate and heavy enough to serve as a weapon, lay several feet from the body, its polished surface catching the light from the desk lamp that still burned steadily, as if nothing had changed. "Father!" Charles rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the still form. His hands hovered uncertainly over Sir Henry's chest, then fell to his sides in defeat. "Someone telephone Dr. Haydock immediately." Lady Eleanor was already moving toward the telephone with admirable efficiency. "And the police," she added quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm afraid this was no accident." Patricia had gone quite white and was gripping the doorframe for support, while Susan pressed herself against the wall, her young eyes taking in every detail with shocking intensity. It was then that Geoffrey appeared in the open French doors, snow clinging to his dark overcoat, his face flushed from the cold. "Good God," he breathed, taking in the scene before him. "What's happened? I heard shouting and—" His words died as his gaze fell on his uncle's motionless form. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations. Miss Marple positioned herself quietly near the bookshelf, watching as the family's shock began to crystallize into something more dangerous. Suspicion. Charles was the first to give voice to what they were all thinking. "You were on the terrace, Geoffrey," he said slowly, his voice carefully controlled. "After your discussion with father." Geoffrey's flush deepened, whether from cold or guilt, Miss Marple couldn't yet determine. "I needed air," he said defensively. "The room was warm and I—" "You were angry," Patricia interrupted, her voice barely, above a whisper. Sir Henry's words were quite harsh about your business troubles. "That doesn't mean I—" Geoffrey began, then stopped, apparently realizing how his protests sounded. His gaze moved from face to face, reading the growing certainty in their expressions. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, summoned by Lady Eleanor's efficient telephone call. His examination was brief but thorough, and his conclusion grimly definitive. "I'm afraid Sir Henry is dead," he announced, straightening slowly. "The head wound appears to be the cause, but given the state of the room—" He paused meaningfully. "Inspector Slack will need to be notified immediately." As the family absorbed this confirmation of their worst fears, Miss Marple continued her quiet observation. She noticed how Geoffrey's coat showed signs of dampness that seemed inconsistent with a brief step outside for air. She observed the way Charles kept glancing toward the open French doors, building his case against his cousin with each look. Most intriguingly, she spotted what appeared to be an official letter, partially hidden beneath the scattered papers on the desk, its formal letterhead suggesting business of some importance. The obvious suspect had emerged with textbook clarity. Geoffrey Blackwood, the financially troubled nephew who had argued publicly with his uncle and been conveniently positioned on the terrace when the murder occurred. The police, when they arrived, would undoubtedly see the same compelling evidence, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most obvious solution was often the most dangerous trap of all. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, accompanied by Constable Davies and the police photographer, his presence immediately transforming the grieving household into a crime scene. Miss Marple had encountered the inspector on previous occasions and recognized his methodical efficiency, though she also knew his unfortunate tendency to pursue the most obvious suspect with unwavering determination. Right then, Inspector Slack announced, after his preliminary survey of the study, "I'll need statements from everyone present this evening. No one leaves the premises until we've established a clear timeline of events." As the family assembled reluctantly in the drawing room, Miss Marple positioned herself near the window, accepting a fresh cup of tea from the still trembling Mrs. Pemberton. Her keen eyes noted details others might overlook. The way Geoffrey's overcoat showed extensive dampness despite his claim of briefly stepping outside, and more intriguingly, the coffee service that Mrs. Pemberton had abandoned in the corridor when she discovered the body. Inspector Slack began his questioning with characteristic thoroughness. Charles provided a measured account of the evening's events, though Miss Marple noticed he carefully minimized the severity of his father's conflict with Geoffrey. Patricia, however, proved less diplomatic in her distress. "Sir Henry was arguing with Geoffrey just before it happened, Inspector," she blurted out, wringing her handkerchief. "Geoffrey was absolutely furious about that bookmark gift. The insult was quite deliberate." Geoffrey's face flushed as all eyes turned to him. "I needed air," he said defensively. The room was stifling and Uncle Henry's comments were difficult to bear. I walked on the terrace for perhaps 20 minutes, trying to collect myself. 20 minutes is rather a long time to stand in falling snow, Inspector Slack observed, making careful notes. "What exactly were you doing out there?" "Thinking," Geoffrey replied, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "wondering whether it was worth attempting to reason with a man who seemed determined to humiliate me publicly." Lady Eleanor, maintaining her composure despite the circumstances, added quietly, "Henry had been concerned about Geoffrey's business difficulties for some months. There had been rather unpleasant correspondence from creditors." This revelation prompted Patricia to speak again, glancing apologetically at her husband. "Charles, you should tell them about the telephone call this afternoon." Charles shifted uncomfortably. Father received a call from his solicitor just before tea. He seemed quite agitated afterward, muttering about making changes and people needing to understand consequences. He spent considerable time in his study after that, moving papers about. Miss Marple found this detail particularly significant. Sir Henry had been conducting urgent business on Christmas Eve, apparently prompted by his solicitor's call. The scattered documents in the study might represent important work interrupted by murder, rather than random debris from a struggle. Inspector Slack's interest sharpened considerably. Mr. Geoffrey Blackwood, did your uncle make any specific threats regarding his will? Geoffrey's composure finally cracked. He threatened to disinherit me entirely if I didn't abandon my business and accept a position as estate manager here. Essentially become his employee, dependent entirely on his goodwill. The admission sent a visible chill through the room. Here was motive, opportunity, and means, all neatly packaged around the obvious suspect. Inspector Slack's satisfaction was evident as he continued building his case. So we have a man facing financial ruin, publicly humiliated, threatened with disinheritance, who then spends 20 minutes alone on the terrace adjacent to the room where his uncle is subsequently murdered. The French doors provided convenient access. As Inspector Slack prepared to take Geoffrey into custody for further questioning, Miss Marple quietly excused herself to powder her nose. In the corridor, she paused beside the abandoned coffee service, noting with her practiced eye that Mrs. Pemberton had prepared 2 cups and saucers, not one. Sir Henry had requested coffee for 2 people, yet no guest had been expected. In his study. Returning to the drawing room, she listened as the family's whispered conversations revealed their growing certainty of Geoffrey's guilt. Even young Susan offered her observation that Geoffrey had looked so guilty during questioning, but Miss Marple felt the familiar prickle of unease that came when a case appeared too perfectly solved. In her extensive experience of human nature, real murderers rarely left such obvious trails of evidence. The most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared entirely innocent, while obvious suspects drew all suspicion. The 2 coffee cups troubled her particularly. They suggested Sir Henry had been expecting someone in his study that evening, someone whose identity he had kept secret from his family. If Geoffrey was the intended visitor, why would he need to enter through the French doors? And if someone else had been expected, where were they when the murder occurred? As Inspector Slack efficiently wrapped up his preliminary investigation, clearly satisfied with his prime suspect, Miss Marple reflected that the most compelling cases were often the most dangerous traps. The truth, she suspected, lay not in the obvious evidence pointing toward Geoffrey, but in the small, overlooked details that everyone else had dismissed as insignificant. Inspector Slack's satisfaction was evident as he formally placed Geoffrey Blackwood under arrest, the words "suspicion of murder" cutting through the Christmas Eve stillness like a blade. Geoffrey's protests of innocence fell on deaf ears as Constable Davies led him away, his face a mask of bewildered fury that seemed to confirm, in the minds of those watching, his guilt. The family, despite their shock, appeared to settle into collective relief that the nightmare had found its obvious conclusion. Miss Marple, however, felt the familiar prickle of unease that came when human behavior failed to align with surface appearances. As the others gathered in subdued clusters, she quietly approached Lady Eleanor with gentle concern. "My dear, perhaps I might assist Mrs. Pemberton in tidying up. The poor woman seems quite overcome, and I imagine you have enough to manage without worrying about household details." Lady Eleanor accepted the offer gratefully, and Miss Marple made her way to the kitchen where she found the housekeeper still trembling at the scrubbed wooden table, a cooling pot of tea before her. "Such a terrible thing, Miss Marple," Mrs. Pemberton whispered, dabbing at her eyes. "And on Christmas Eve of all nights. Sir Henry was such a particular gentleman about his routines." Miss Marple settled beside her, her voice gentle but purposeful. "You mentioned preparing coffee for Sir Henry. Was that his usual evening custom?" "Oh no, miss. Sir Henry rarely took coffee after dinner, said it kept him awake. But tonight he specifically requested it, said he was expecting someone and wanted to be alert for their discussion." Mrs. Pemberton's voice dropped to a whisper. "He seemed quite agitated about it, kept checking his pocket watch and pacing about. Asked for the blue Wedgwood set, the little one with the forget-me-nots. He never specified particular china, not like that." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. The blue Wedgwood was delicate, feminine, hardly the robust service one would choose for a heated confrontation with an angry nephew. How curious, and the French doors. He asked me to unlock them earlier in the evening, said his visitor preferred discretion and would enter through the terrace. Most unusual, that was. I'd bolted them myself at 6, after laying the fire on account of Sir Henry's complaints about drafts. The timeline was becoming clearer and more troubling. Sir Henry had arranged a secret meeting, preparing carefully for a visitor who required discretion. Yet when Mrs. Pemberton discovered the tragedy, the coffee service remained on her abandoned tray in the corridor, suggesting the murder occurred just before the expected meeting, not after a heated confrontation. Miss Marple excused herself and made a brief tour of the corridor, her keen eyes noting details others had overlooked. In the cloakroom, melted snow beneath one peg suggested someone had hung up damp outerwear, and a pearl-headed pin lay forgotten in the corner. Most tellingly, a sprig of holly with its berries smashed to a crimson smear on the wooden bench indicated someone had fumbled with a corsage in considerable haste. Meanwhile, from the drawing room came the voices of the family, their discussions revealing how quickly they had embraced Geoffrey's guilt. Charles was pacing with newfound authority, already discussing funeral arrangements and estate matters with Lady Eleanor. Patricia's earlier pallor had given way to a flush of relief, and she spoke openly of Geoffrey's desperation and violent temper. It was young Susan who voiced the observation that troubled Miss Marple most. But why would Uncle Geoffrey enter through the French doors if he was already inside the house? That seems rather unnecessarily dramatic. Her astute comment was dismissed by the adults, but Miss Marple found it remarkably perceptive. The girl had identified the logical flaw that made the case against Geoffrey feel contrived rather than convincing. Dr. Haydock's quiet conversation with Inspector Slack provided another troubling detail. The head wound's angle suggested an attacker of similar height to Sir Henry, yet Geoffrey was notably taller than his uncle. The brass letter opener, positioned almost theatrically near the body, felt too perfectly placed for a crime of sudden passion. As the grey light of Christmas morning began to filter through the windows, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's revelations. The obvious case against Geoffrey was compelling but built on assumptions rather than facts. The secret meeting, the careful preparation of delicate china, the wound angle, and, most significantly, the mysterious visitor who had prompted Sir Henry's urgent discretion all pointed to a more complex truth than Inspector Slack's straightforward solution. The family's palpable relief at Geoffrey's removal troubled her most of all. In her extensive experience, real murderers often participated enthusiastically in condemning obvious suspects, using collective certainty as their most effective camouflage. The true killer, she suspected, was watching the proceedings with satisfaction, confident that their careful planning had succeeded in directing suspicion elsewhere. Miss Marple knew that the small, seemingly insignificant details, the 2 coffee cups, the smashed holly berries, the pearl pin, were often the threads that, when gently tugged, unraveled entire tapestries of deception. The pale Christmas morning light filtering through the frost-etched windows revealed details that the previous evening's shadows had concealed. Miss Marple, having slept little in the small guest room Lady Eleanor had insisted she occupy, found herself drawn once again to the terrace where the tragedy had unfolded. The snow had ceased falling, leaving behind a pristine canvas that told its own silent story to those who possessed the patience to read it carefully. Geoffrey's footprints were indeed clearly visible, creating the restless pattern of a man pacing in evident agitation from the French doors to the stone balustrade and back again. But Miss Marple's keen eyes detected something far more significant. A second set of prints, smaller and more delicate, approaching the terrace from the garden path. These prints led directly to the French doors, but showed no corresponding exit marks, suggesting their owner had either departed by a different route or, more troublingly, had never left the study at all during the crucial moments. The discovery sent an uncomfortable chill through Miss Marple that had nothing to do with the winter morning air. Someone else had visited Sir Henry's study through the terrace entrance, someone whose presence had been carefully concealed by the continuing snowfall or by more deliberate means. Inside the manor, she encountered Mrs. Pemberton in the kitchen, already attempting to restore normalcy through the familiar rituals of morning tea preparation. The housekeeper's hands still trembled slightly as she managed the china, and Miss Marple settled beside her with gentle concern. "Such a dreadful night for all of us," Miss Marple observed softly. "You mentioned preparing coffee for Sir Henry yesterday evening. Was that his usual custom?" Mrs. Pemberton shook her head emphatically. "Oh, no, miss. Sir Henry rarely took coffee after dinner, claimed it disturbed his sleep, but last evening he specifically requested it, said he was expecting someone and needed to remain alert for their discussion." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He seemed quite particular about the service, too. Asked for the blue Wedgwood set with the forget-me-nots. Never specified particular china before, not like that." Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably. The delicate Wedgwood was hardly the robust service one would choose for a heated confrontation with an angry nephew. "How thoughtful of him. And the French doors. He asked me to unlock them earlier. Said his visitor preferred discretion and would enter through the terrace. Most unusual, that was. I'd secured them myself at 6 o'clock after laying the fire." Mrs. Pemberton's voice grew troubled. "And there was something else, miss. When I passed the cloakroom around 9:30, I noticed the floor mat was fresh wet. Dripping, it was. Someone had hung up a coat that was thoroughly snowed over. There was a scent lingering too. Violets. Heavy and sweet-like." Miss Marple made her way to the small back hall where various outdoor garments were kept. Near the warming range, a pair of fashionable ladies' ankle boots steamed gently, their black kid leather drying in tight ripples. The soles bore an elegant floral rosette stamped into the heel, but what captured Miss Marple's attention was the packed snow still embedded around one heel, not yet fully melted, and the faint smear of red, holly berries crushed to pulp, clinging to the boot's welt. Patricia appeared moments later, pale but with an underlying flush of color, her dressing gown cinched perhaps too tightly for comfort. "Oh," she exclaimed upon seeing Miss Marple. "Mrs. Pemberton mentioned you were here. How very thoughtful of you to help during such difficult circumstances." "The ordinary kindnesses help restore balance," Miss Marple replied gently, noting how Patricia's gaze moved immediately toward the drying boots. "Such lovely holly you wore yesterday evening. It gave you quite a festive appearance." Patricia's hand flew instinctively to her lapel, where a small tear in the fabric revealed where a corsage pin had once been secured. A faint dusting of green showed against the pink wool. "Oh, that. I must have lost it somewhere. Clumsy of me. Perhaps in the drawing room." "Holly can be rather willful," Miss Marple observed mildly. "So many sharp surprises hidden among the pretty leaves." Patricia's laugh carried a tremulous note as she excused herself with obvious haste, leaving Miss Marple to contemplate the growing collection of small but significant details. Later, while Inspector Slack conducted his methodical examination of Sir Henry's papers, Miss Marple found an opportunity to study the study more carefully. Beneath a heavy leather ledger, partially concealed among the scattered correspondence, lay a formal document that had escaped the inspector's attention. It was a letter bearing the crest of a prestigious London art gallery, and its contents proved illuminating indeed. The letter was an offer, a remarkably substantial offer, for a specific painting in Sir Henry's private collection, described as a Blackwood family heirloom of considerable historical and financial value. Most significantly, the offer stipulated a firm deadline. Acceptance was required by the end of Christmas Eve. This revelation cast Sir Henry's evening agitation in an entirely different light, suggesting his urgent business had nothing to do with Geoffrey's debts or will modifications, but rather with a decision that would affect the very heart of the family legacy. Dr. Haydick's arrival with additional medical findings provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. His more thorough examination revealed that Sir Henry's head wound had been delivered by someone facing him directly, and the defensive wound on his left hand indicated he had seen the attack coming and attempted to ward it off. Most telling, Dr. Haydock explained to Inspector Slack, is the angle of the primary wound. It suggests an attacker of similar height to Sir Henry, striking in a moment of direct confrontation rather than from surprise. Miss Marple reflected on this detail with growing certainty. Geoffrey stood a good 4 inches taller than his uncle, making such a direct downward strike awkward and unnatural. Charles, however, was almost precisely Sir Henry's height, as was Patricia when accounting for her fashionable heeled boots. Young Susan's quiet observation during the family's subdued breakfast proved equally significant. I went to say good night to grandfather. She confided to Miss Marple when the adults were distracted with legal discussions. I heard voices in the corridor and didn't want to be caught listening, so I stepped behind the large poinsettia. I saw Mother coming from the direction of the study, adjusting her hair. She looked quite cross and told me to return to the drawing room immediately. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a pattern far more complex than Inspector Slack's straightforward solution. The mysterious visitor Sir Henry had expected, the careful preparation of feminine china, the second set of footprints, the violet scent, the crushed holly berries, and most crucially, the art gallery letter, all pointed toward a truth that had nothing to do with Geoffrey's financial desperation and everything to do with family secrets, hidden motives, and the desperate measures people would take to protect what they considered rightfully theirs. Miss Marple understood now that the real murderer had been counting on Geoffrey's obvious guilt to provide perfect camouflage for a far more calculated crime. The art sale would have changed everything. The family's financial situation, the inheritance structure, perhaps even the balance of power within the household. Someone had been willing to kill to prevent that change, and they had very nearly succeeded in their deception. The small, seemingly insignificant details that others had dismissed, the pearl-headed pin forgotten in the cloakroom, the smashed holly berries, the 2 coffee cups that were never served, were beginning to weave together into a tapestry of guilt that pointed in a direction no one had thought to look. The pale light of Christmas morning cast long shadows across Thornfield Manor, transforming the scene of the previous night's tragedy into something almost ethereal. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night contemplating the various threads of evidence, found herself drawn once again to the small details that others had dismissed as insignificant. Inspector Slack, though confident in Geoffrey's arrest, remained at the manor to conduct additional interviews, his methodical approach providing Miss Marple with opportunities to pursue her own quiet investigation. Her first discovery came in the cloakroom, where a pair of ladies' ankle boots sat drying near the warming range. The black kid leather showed the telltale signs of recent wear in snow, with packed ice still clinging to the decorative rosettes on the heels. More significantly, crushed holly berries were embedded in the leather welt, their crimson stain matching the fragments Miss Marple had noticed on the wooden bench the previous evening. Mrs. Pemberton, when gently questioned, confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions. "Those belong to Mrs. Charles, miss. She said she'd gotten them wet somehow during the evening. Asked me to set them by the range first thing this morning." The housekeeper's voice dropped to a whisper. "And there was such a strong scent of violets in the cloakroom last night. Quite overpowering it was." Miss Marple's attention was then drawn to Patricia herself, who appeared in the morning room wearing a fresh dress but bearing subtle signs of the previous evening's ordeal. A small tear in the fabric of her pink wool sleeve revealed where a corsage pin had been hastily removed, and despite her careful grooming, a faint dusting of green showed against the pale fabric. Holly leaves, crushed to powder. The breakthrough came when Miss Marple discovered the art gallery correspondence that Inspector Slack had overlooked. Hidden beneath Sir Henry's leather desk blotter lay a formal letter bearing an impressive London Gallery's letterhead. The document revealed a substantial offer for a painting described as Lady Arabella Blackwood, attributed to Reynolds, circa 1780. A family portrait that had hung in the manor's main corridor for generations. Most crucially, the offer required acceptance by midnight on Christmas Eve. creating an urgent deadline that explained Sir Henry's agitated behavior throughout the evening. Lady Eleanor, when approached about the matter, confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions with obvious reluctance. Henry had been corresponding with several galleries about our collection. The financial pressures of maintaining the estate had become quite severe. Her voice carried a note of bitter resignation. Charles was absolutely opposed to selling Lady Arabella's portrait. He considered it tantamount to selling the family's soul. This revelation cast the family dynamics in an entirely new light. Charles, despite his outward composure, had been under tremendous financial strain, as evidenced by the urgent telephone conversations Miss Marple had overheard him conducting with creditors. The sale of the portrait would have provided Sir Henry with the capital he needed, but would have devastated Charles's sense of family heritage and, more practically, reduced the estate's value for inheritance purposes. Patricia's involvement became clearer when Susan, with the uncomfortable perceptiveness of youth, mentioned her mother's recent interest in the family's art collection. Mother had been asking grandfather lots of questions about which paintings were most valuable. The girl confided to Miss Marple. She seemed particularly concerned about Lady Arabella's portrait. The situation grew more complex when news arrived that Geoffrey had been seen by the village constable walking on the main road around 10 o'clock the previous evening, providing him with a partial alibi for the estimated time of death. Inspector Slack's confidence in his obvious suspect began to waver as this new information emerged, forcing him to reconsider the evidence more carefully. Miss Marple reflected on the pattern emerging from her observations. The delicate Wedgwood coffee service, prepared for two but never used, suggested Sir Henry had arranged a private meeting with someone who required discretion. The violet scent, the crushed holly berries, the second set of footprints leading to the French doors all pointed to Patricia as the mysterious visitor Sir Henry had been expecting. The motive was becoming clear. Patricia, driven by financial insecurity and her husband's desperate need to preserve the family assets, had attempted to dissuade Sir Henry from the sale through a private appeal. When persuasion failed, desperation had led to violence, with Geoffrey's convenient presence on the terrace providing the perfect scapegoat for a carefully planned murder disguised as a crime of passion. As the family gathered for their subdued Christmas breakfast, Miss Marple sensed the growing tension beneath their composed facades. The real killer was still among them, and time was running short before the truth would inevitably surface. The subdued atmosphere of Christmas morning was punctuated by Constable Davy's arrival with news that would shatter Inspector Slack's carefully constructed case. Mrs. Hartwell, the village postmistress, had observed Geoffrey Blackwood walking along the main road toward St. Mary Mead at precisely 10 o'clock the previous evening, the church bells having just finished chiming the hour, when she noticed his distinctive tall figure trudging through the snow. Miss Marple watched the family's reaction to this development with her characteristic quiet attention. Charles displayed obvious confusion, his certainty about Geoffrey's guilt wavering visibly. Lady Eleanor maintained her composed demeanour, though her fingers tightened around her teacup. Most tellingly, Patricia went quite pale and excused herself abruptly, claiming she needed to check something in the kitchen. Inspector Slack's confidence crumbled as the implications became clear. If Geoffrey had been walking toward the village at 10 o'clock, he could hardly have committed murder at Thornfield Manor 15 minutes later. The brass letter opener, positioned so conveniently near Sir Henry's body, now seemed almost theatrically placed rather than dropped in genuine struggle. It was while Inspector Slack grappled with this revelation that Mrs. Pemberton's cry echoed from the long gallery. They found her standing before an empty space where Lady Arabella Blackwood's portrait had hung for generations. The gilt hooks were bare, tiny crumbs of plaster dust scattered on the polished floor, and a smear of dark wax marked the moulding where someone had pried the heavy frame from the wall. "Good heavens," Lady Eleanor breathed, her composure finally wavering. "The portrait! It's gone!" Charles's reaction was immediate and violent. He strode to the wall, hand outstretched, then turned with his face flushed crimson. "This is what comes of chaos," he said savagely. "The moment a family is wounded, the vultures circle." Inspector Slack examined the scene methodically, noting the absence of any signs of forced entry. "Someone took this from inside the house," he concluded. "Recently." His attention was drawn to a small, gleaming object half hidden beneath a curl of dropped holly from yesterday's decorations. An antique cufflink, oval and engraved with a blackwood crest. Charles's hand flew instinctively to his shirt cuff, where a plain mother-of-pearl stud now replaced what should have been its ornate companion. "I lost it last night," he said too quickly. "Somewhere. That proves nothing." The revelation that transformed everything came when Charles, sorting through his father's private papers with newfound authority, discovered a sealed envelope in Sir Henry's locked escritoire. The document inside was dated just 2 days prior, a new will that revoked all previous bequests to Charles and Patricia, instead placing the estate in a charitable trust with Geoffrey as manager and primary beneficiary. The room erupted in shocked protests. "This is outrageous." Charles's carefully maintained composure shattered completely. "He can't do this. It's clearly the work of a disturbed mind." Patricia's whispered, "My God," carried the weight of dawning horror as the implications became clear. Their comfortable future, everything they had assumed was secure, had been swept away by Sir Henry's pen just hours before his death. Miss Marple observed the scene with quiet satisfaction, though her heart ached for the human desperation she witnessed. The new will explained everything: Sir Henry's agitation after the solicitor's call, his muttering about making changes, and people understanding consequences. He had not merely been contemplating alterations to his legacy. He had already executed them. The killer's deception was now transparent. The murder had been committed not in a fit of rage over Geoffrey's debts, but to prevent this devastating will from becoming public knowledge. By killing Sir Henry before the new document could be properly witnessed and filed, the murderer had ensured that the previous will, benefiting Charles and Patricia, would remain valid. Inspector Slack's gaze moved between Charles and Patricia with new understanding. The motive for Geoffrey's supposed crime had vanished, replaced by an overwhelming reason for the immediate family to commit murder. The convenient presence of Geoffrey on the terrace, his earlier argument with Sir Henry, had provided perfect camouflage for a desperate act of self-preservation. Young Susan's innocent observation cut through the tension like a blade. "I heard someone in the gallery around midnight," she said quietly. "Heavy footsteps. I thought it was father, but he was with Dr. Haydock then, wasn't he?" Dr. Haydock, when questioned, confirmed he had been with Charles shortly after 11 o'clock. Not midnight, prescribing a mild sedative for the man's obvious distress. The timeline was becoming clearer and more damning. Miss Marple's attention drifted to the physical evidence accumulating around them: the violet scent in the cloakroom, the crushed holly berries on Patricia's boots, the delicate Wedgwood coffee service prepared for a discreet meeting, the second set of footprints leading to the French doors, all pointed to Patricia as Sir Henry's mysterious visitor, the person he had been expecting when death interrupted their appointment. The missing portrait represented the final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. With Sir Henry dead and the new will temporarily concealed, removing Lady Arabella's valuable portrait would provide immediate funds while preserving the fiction that the family's financial situation remained stable. As the morning light grew stronger, casting sharp shadows across the scene of multiple crimes, Miss Marple reflected on the terrible mathematics of desperation. Charles and Patricia had not merely committed murder. They had orchestrated an elaborate deception designed to destroy an innocent man while preserving their own carefully constructed lives. The truth was emerging with inexorable clarity, but Miss Marple knew that proving guilt beyond doubt would require more than circumstantial evidence and convenient timing. The real challenge lay in drawing out a confession from those who had already demonstrated considerable cunning in their attempts to escape justice. The game was far from over, But the players had finally been identified, and their desperate moves were becoming increasingly transparent to those who understood the true nature of human greed and fear. The atmosphere at Thornfield Manor grew increasingly tense as Inspector Slack ordered a comprehensive search of the premises. The discovery of Sir Henry's new will had transformed the investigation entirely, shifting suspicion from Geoffrey's obvious guilt to the more complex motivations of the immediate family. Constable Davies and 2 additional officers methodically worked through every room, while Miss Marple continued her own quiet observations, noting the small details that others invariably overlooked. Their first significant discovery came in the disused box room beneath the eaves, where Lady Arabella's ornate frame lay hastily concealed behind dusty trunks. The heavy gilt molding showed signs of careful prying rather than violent destruction, and most tellingly, the canvas had been cut away with professional precision rather than a thief's impatient slashing. This was done by someone who understood the painting's construction, Dr. Haydock observed, examining the clean edges where the canvas had been separated from its stretchers. Someone familiar with art restoration techniques. Miss Marple recalled Patricia's recent inquiries about the family's art collection, questions that had seemed merely curious at the time but now appeared far more significant. The delicate work required both knowledge and steady nerves, qualities that suggested premeditation rather than desperate improvisation. The morning's most startling revelation arrived via telegraph boy, his bicycle wheels crunching through fresh snow as he delivered a message that would shatter the family's remaining composure. Lady Eleanor read the wire with trembling hands before passing it to Inspector Slack. Acceptance received. Christmas Eve. Stop courier en route to collect Lady Arabella. Stop payment to follow by bank. Transfer. Stop. Charles stared at the telegram in bewilderment. Acceptance? I made no such call. Geoffrey, surely you didn't... Geoffrey, who had been brought back under escort for additional questioning, shook his head emphatically. I telephoned yesterday afternoon, pleading for an extension. They refused categorically. I certainly made no acceptance. Inspector Slack's gaze moved between Charles and Patricia with new intensity. Someone with access to this house contacted that gallery. Someone who knew about the deadline and had authority to speak for the family. Patricia's face had gone chalk white, her hands clutching her handkerchief so tightly that her knuckles showed stark against the fabric. Anyone could have made such a call, she said, her voice pitched higher than usual. Perhaps Sir Henry himself before... Her words trailed off as the implications became clear. Sir Henry had been murdered before the gallery's deadline, making any acceptance call a posthumous impossibility unless made by someone else entirely. Further evidence emerged from the kitchen, where Mrs. Pemberton's distressed discovery of broken porcelain in the scullery pail provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple carefully retrieved fragments of the delicate blue Wedgwood, noting the coral-tinted smear on one piece, lipstick hastily wiped but not entirely removed. The coffee service that was never used, Miss Marple murmured, examining the evidence. Someone destroyed it to eliminate traces of their presence. The van driver's testimony added another layer of incrimination. Summoned by Constable Davies, he produced a hastily written note bearing a single initial, P. The instruction was succinct and telling. Use the orchard gate. Wait quietly. Avoid disturbing the household. As the evidence mounted systematically against Patricia, Miss Marple recognized the moment had arrived for her characteristic approach, the gentle psychological test that would reveal truth more effectively than harsh interrogation. She settled into her chair near the morning room window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she addressed the assembled family. You know, she began conversationally, I once knew a young woman in Much Benham who found herself in remarkably similar circumstances. A family heirloom, financial pressures, a stubborn patriarch who refused to listen to reason. Her voice carried the deceptive casualness that concealed sharp observation. Patricia's reaction was immediate and telling. Her restless fidgeting ceased entirely, her attention focusing on Miss Marple with uncomfortable intensity. This young woman wore a distinctive brooch to her final meeting with her father. Miss Marple continued, her tone remaining gentle but purposeful. A delicate piece with pearls and garnets. In her distress during their confrontation, she lost it. Such a small thing easily overlooked. But when the police eventually found it near the scene, it became quite significant indeed. The silence that followed was profound. Patricia's breathing had become shallow and rapid, her face cycling through expressions of recognition, fear, and dawning horror. Her gaze flickered involuntarily toward the cloakroom where her boots had dried, toward the pantry where the porcelain fragments had been hastily discarded, toward the terrace where her footprints still marked the snow. Miss Marple's seemingly innocent story had struck its target with devastating accuracy, revealing through Patricia's visceral reaction the guilt that careful planning had failed to conceal. The psychological game was complete, and the truth lay exposed in the trembling hands and terrified eyes of a woman who had believed herself safely hidden behind another's obvious culpability. The effect of Miss Marple's gentle parable settled over the morning room like morning mist, seemingly innocent yet obscuring nothing from her keen observation. Patricia's hands had gone perfectly still against her skirt, her breathing shallow and controlled, but her eyes betrayed the growing panic of someone watching their carefully constructed world crumble piece by inevitable piece. Miss Marple continued her knitting with practiced serenity, her needles clicking softly in the charged silence. You know, it's remarkable how the smallest details insist on telling their own stories, quite independent of what we might prefer them to say. Her voice carried that deceptive gentleness that had unraveled so many carefully guarded secrets over the years. Sir Henry made such particular preparations yesterday evening, she observed, her tone conversational yet purposeful. Mrs. Pemberton tells us he specifically requested coffee, most unusual for a gentleman who claimed it disturbed his sleep. But more telling still, he asked for the delicate blue Wedgwood service, the one with the forget-me-nots. Such a feminine choice, don't you think? Hardly the robust china one would select for a heated confrontation with an angry nephew. Patricia's composure began showing hairline cracks, like porcelain under pressure. Her fingers worried at the torn edge of her handkerchief, and Charles moved instinctively closer to his wife, though whether to protect or restrain her remained unclear. The French doors were unlocked at Sir Henry's specific request. Miss Marple continued, her observation encompassing the entire room. He mentioned to Mrs. Pemberton that his visitor preferred discretion, such thoughtful preparation for someone who valued privacy above convenience. The violet scent that lingered in the cloakroom, the second set of footprints in the snow leading directly to those same French doors, all evidence of a carefully arranged meeting. Inspector Slack leaned forward, his notebook ready, but Miss Marple's gentle gesture forestalled his interruption. The moment required delicate handling, for truth extracted too harshly often shattered into fragments that could never be properly reassembled. The coffee service was prepared for two but never used, Miss Marple noted, her needles resuming their rhythmic clicking. Instead it was hastily destroyed, broken porcelain hidden in the scullery pail. But lipstick, I've found, leaves such stubborn traces on delicate china. The coral shade was quite distinctive. Patricia's breath caught audibly, her face draining of color as each carefully buried detail emerged into the unforgiving light of scrutiny. "You went to see Sir Henry that evening," Miss Marple said, her voice carrying no accusation, merely understanding. "He had telephoned you after his conversation with the solicitor, hadn't he? Not to argue or threaten, but to explain his decision personally. Such characteristic kindness, even when delivering devastating news." The confession emerged in painful fragments, each word dragged from Patricia with visible effort. "He was so calm about it," she whispered, tears beginning to flow unchecked. "Explained that the new will was necessary, that Charles and I had become too dependent on inherited security. Said Geoffrey had shown more genuine responsibility for the estate's welfare." her voice cracked with remembered desperation. But he didn't understand. We had. Creditors threatening foreclosure, Charles's business ventures had failed, and Susan's school fees. Miss Marple nodded with gentle comprehension. Financial pressure creates such terrible urgency in people's thinking. When Sir Henry refused to reconsider, when he made clear that his decision was final, desperation took precedence over reason. The scene in Sir Henry's study unfolded through Patricia's halting narrative. Her pleas had been met with kind but implacable refusal. When she had reached for the will documents, hoping to destroy them in a moment of panic, Sir Henry had moved to stop her. The brass letter opener, lying conveniently on his desk, had become a weapon in an instant of blind terror. The wound angle told its own story, Miss Marple observed quietly. Dr. Haydock noted that Sir Henry's attacker was of similar height, striking in direct confrontation. Geoffrey is considerably taller than his uncle, making such a blow awkward and unnatural. But you, my dear, are almost precisely Sir Henry's height, particularly when accounting for those fashionable heeled boots. Charles had remained silent throughout his wife's confession, his face cycling through shock, grief, and dawning horror as the full scope of their deception became clear. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man watching his entire world collapse. "I found her afterward," he said slowly, his words heavy with terrible understanding. "She was standing over father, trembling, saying it had been an accident. I believed her. I still want to believe her." His gaze moved between his wife and Miss Marple with desperate appeal. "But when I saw Geoffrey on the terrace, when I realized how perfectly he could be blamed—" "You helped arrange the scene," Miss Marple finished gently. The letter opener positioned theatrically near the body. The French doors opened wider to suggest Geoffrey's convenient access. In your haste, you lost the antique cufflink that was later found in the gallery, where you had removed Lady Arabella's portrait. The systematic revelation continued as Miss Marple connected each thread of evidence into an unbreakable chain of guilt. The telephone call accepting the gallery's offer, made by Patricia, using Sir Henry's authority after his death. The careful removal of the valuable portrait, its canvas cut with precision that suggested knowledge of art. Conservation techniques, the desperate attempt to create immediate funds while maintaining the fiction that their financial situation remained stable. The pearl pin found in the cloakroom, Miss Marple noted, the crushed holly berries embedded in boot leather, the violet scent that had no business in a gentleman's household, all small details that insisted on being remembered, despite your careful attempts to erase them. Patricia's composure finally crumbled completely, her careful mask dissolving into raw grief and terror. "I never meant for it to go so far," she sobbed. "I only wanted to reason with him, to make him understand what his decision would mean for Susan's future, for everything we had worked to build. But he laughed, actually laughed, when I mentioned our creditors, said perhaps some hardship would teach Charles the value of honest work." The confession was complete, but its emotional aftermath would resonate far beyond the immediate tragedy. Inspector Slack moved forward with professional efficiency, his duty clear despite the human wreckage spread before him. As the handcuffs clicked into place with delicate finality, Miss Marple reflected sadly on the terrible mathematics of human desperation. How quickly ordinary people could transform into criminals when their security was threatened, and how the smallest overlooked details invariably revealed the truth that careful planning had tried so desperately to conceal. The Christmas morning light streaming through the frost-etched windows seemed to mock the festive decorations still adorning the room, their cheerful colors now appearing garish against the stark reality of murder, deception, and a family destroyed by their own desperate choices. The handcuffs closed around Patricia's wrists with a soft click that seemed to echo through the morning room's festive stillness, transforming her desperate sobs into the final punctuation of a tragedy that had begun with financial desperation and culminated in murder. Inspector Slack's professional efficiency could not entirely mask his discomfort as he led away a woman who, mere hours before, had appeared to be nothing more than a grieving daughter-in-law struggling with family loss. Charles stood frozen beside the window, his face cycling through shock, grief, and dawning horror as he watched his wife being escorted toward the waiting police car. When Inspector Slack turned to him with practiced inevitability, Charles raised his hands with tired resignation, confessing only to what his conscience allowed, opening the French doors wider, positioning the letter opener as false evidence, telephoning the gallery after midnight. He denied planning murder, insisted he had acted only to protect his wife, and begged that Susan be kept from the newspapers. Geoffrey's release came with anticlimactic swiftness, Inspector Slack's apologies carrying the formal tone of official regret. The man who had spent Christmas Eve branded as his uncle's murderer now found himself free but forever marked by suspicion that would linger in village memory. "I should feel vindicated," he confided to Miss Marple as they watched the police vehicles disappear down the snow-covered drive. "Instead, I wonder whether Uncle Henry's assessment of my character was more accurate than I wanted to admit." Miss Marple's response carried the gentle wisdom of someone who had witnessed the full spectrum of human weakness. "Self-recrimination is a luxury we can rarely afford, Mr. Blackwood. Your uncle's decision reflected his own values, not a judgment of your fundamental worth. What matters now is how you choose to honor the trust he placed in you." Young Susan appeared in the doorway with the bewildered expression of someone watching their familiar world transform into something unrecognizable. "Mother?" she whispered, her voice carrying fragile hope that some explanation might restore normalcy. "What's happening?" Lady Eleanor moved toward her granddaughter with remarkable composure, her arms extending to provide comfort in a situation that offered no adequate consolation. The practical implications of Sir Henry's death began asserting themselves with inexorable momentum. The new will would transfer estate management to Geoffrey, the art sale would proceed under legal supervision, and the family's extensive debts would require careful restructuring. Dr. Haydock's quiet revelation to the assembled family cast Sir Henry's harsh Christmas Eve words in heartbreaking new light. He knew about the creditors, the failed investments, the mounting debts. His correspondence reveals months of careful planning, designed to preserve the estate while providing Charles and Patricia with sufficient support to rebuild their lives on solid foundations. The bitter irony was inescapable. Sir Henry had died trying to protect the very people who killed him. News spread through St. Mary Mead with the discreet efficiency of snowmelt. By midday, every gathering became a forum for dissecting the Blackwood tragedy. Some expressed outrage, others grim satisfaction that pride always preceded a fall, but most felt profound unease. If such darkness could lurk behind Thornfield Manor's respectable facade, what secrets might hide behind their own cottage doors? Miss Marple remained another day, offering quiet comfort to Lady Eleanor and Susan. She observed Geoffrey beginning the daunting task of managing Sir Henry's affairs, carrying himself with new solemnity, his earlier bitterness replaced by quiet determination to honor his uncle's unexpected faith. Before departing, Miss Marple found Susan by the drawing-room window, staring at the snow-covered grounds. "It's all so confusing," the girl said softly. "How could Mother and Father—" Miss Marple settled beside her, gently taking her hand. "Human nature is complicated, my dear, full of light and shadow often intertwined. Your grandfather made a decision he believed was right. Your mother, in her fear and desperation, saw only ruin. Sometimes, when people are afraid, they make choices they would never dream of otherwise." She paused, looking out at the tranquil village. "The important thing is remembering that even in the darkest moments, there is always hope for understanding and new beginnings. Life, like the seasons, always finds ways to renew itself even after the harshest winter." As Miss Marple prepared to return to her cottage, the familiar crunch of snow beneath her sensible boots felt comforting. A soft thaw had begun, icicles releasing their hold with gentle sighs, roads becoming passable again. The Blackwood family, once a bastion of tradition, was now irrevocably altered, its secrets laid bare, its future uncertain. But in the quiet aftermath, amidst lingering unease, there was also the faint promise of healing, testament to the enduring, if sometimes painful, resilience of the human spirit. The Christmas death had indeed pointed to Sir Henry's family, but it had also revealed the intricate, often desperate workings of the human heart when cornered by circumstances beyond control. The gentle thaw that began on Boxing Day continued through the new year, transforming St. Mary Mead from its Christmas card perfection into the familiar, comfortable village Miss Marple had always known. Yet beneath this return to ordinary rhythms, the Blackwood tragedy cast shadows that would take far longer to dissipate than winter snow. Inspector Slack's final report confirmed the physical evidence that Miss Marple's keen observations had already revealed. The brass letter opener bore traces of blood consistent with the fatal wound, while Patricia's coral lipstick remained stubbornly visible on fragments of the shattered Wedgwood coffee service, despite her desperate attempts to destroy the evidence. Most damning of all, Lady Arabella's canvas was discovered rolled beneath a false bottom in Patricia's wardrobe, wrapped in a violet-scented shawl that explained the lingering fragrance Mrs. Pemberton had noticed in the cloakroom. The legal proceedings moved with inexorable efficiency. Patricia faced charges of murder, while Charles was charged as an accessory after the fact. Geoffrey, his name finally cleared, approached his unexpected inheritance with sobering dignity. His first decision revealed the character Sir Henry had recognized beneath the surface difficulties. He arranged for the estate to fund Patricia and Charles's legal defense, ensuring they would receive fair representation despite their circumstances. Lady Eleanor managed the family's public disgrace with characteristic composure, her primary concern becoming Susan's welfare. The girl proved remarkably resilient, her natural intelligence helping her navigate the complicated emotions surrounding her parents' actions. When Miss Marple found her reading in the library one afternoon, Susan's question was characteristically direct. "Will they come back?" Miss Marple considered her response carefully, recognizing the importance of honesty tempered with hope. "Your parents made terrible choices born from desperation and fear," she said gently. "They will face consequences for those choices, but that doesn't mean their story ends there. People can change, learn from their mistakes, find ways to rebuild their lives even after the darkest chapters." The village's reaction evolved from initial shock through morbid fascination to something approaching uncomfortable understanding. The tragedy served as a stark reminder that financial pressures and family tensions existed behind many respectable facades, and that ordinary people could be driven to extraordinary acts when cornered by circumstances they felt powerless to control. Dr. Haydock's medical analysis provided the final confirmation of Miss Marple's deductions. Patricia's crime had been impulsive rather than premeditated, the desperate act of someone who saw her family's security crumbling and grasped at the nearest solution without considering consequences. The evidence of careful planning that had initially suggested cold calculation proved instead to reflect Charles's panicked attempts to protect his wife after discovering her deed. On her final morning at Thornfield Manor, Miss Marple helped Lady Eleanor sort through Sir Henry's personal effects, a task that revealed the depth of his concern for his family's welfare. Hidden among his private papers was an undelivered letter to Charles, explaining his reasoning with characteristic bluntness tempered by genuine affection, outlining a careful plan that would have preserved both the estate's integrity and the family's security through Geoffrey's capable management. "He truly believed he was protecting us," Lady Eleanor murmured, her composure finally wavering. "Charles would have understood, given time. Patricia might have found peace with the arrangement if fear hadn't overwhelmed her judgment." Young Susan appeared as Miss Marple prepared to depart, carrying a small parcel tied with crimson string. Inside lay the simple leather bookmark Sir Henry had given Geoffrey on that fateful Christmas Eve. "Mother says a bookmark is for turning pages," Susan told Miss Marple gravely, "and sometimes one must turn one even if one hasn't finished reading. May I leave it here? It looks as if it would be happy where books are used kindly." Miss Marple accepted the gift with gentle understanding, recognizing the wisdom embedded in the child's gesture, a mark to hold a place while life's story continued elsewhere, forever changed but not necessarily without hope. As her taxi arrived to carry her back to her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the lessons embedded within the Blackwood tragedy. The melting snow revealed patches of dark earth beneath, mirroring the messy reality that had been uncovered beneath the family's respectable facade. Financial desperation could transform loving family members into adversaries. Fear could drive decent people to commit acts they would never have imagined possible, and the most obvious explanations often concealed more complex truths beneath their surface simplicity. Standing in her own familiar sitting room once again, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with quiet satisfaction. The case of the Christmas death had revealed not just guilt and innocence, but the intricate web of relationships, pressures, and choices that shaped human behavior in moments of crisis. Patricia and Charles would face justice for their actions, but their story also served as a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, understanding and compassion remained possible. Outside her window, St. Mary Mead continued its eternal rhythms, its residents carrying their own secrets, fears, and hopes beneath their carefully maintained facades. She had helped reveal one family's hidden tragedy, but she knew that countless others remained, waiting for the right combination of observation, patience, and human understanding to bring them into the light where healing might finally begin. Miss Marple tucked Susan's bookmark into her favorite anthology and settled into her chair by the fire. The small details would always tell their stories to those wise enough to listen. The wrong china for a tense meeting, the telling scent of violets, the crushed holly berries, the second set of footprints in the snow. These seemingly insignificant threads, when gently pulled, invariably unraveled the most intricate deceptions, revealing the eternal truth that in quiet villages, just as in bustling cities, the human heart remained an endlessly fascinating and often deadly mystery. The Christmas death that had pointed to Sir Henry's family was closed, not happily perhaps, but justly. And in the small rooms of St. Mary Mead, justice and gentleness could live together well enough if one kept them warm and treated them, like good china, with everyday respect.